Hi, and welcome to Ideas on Track. In the light of the ongoing global pandemic, we will be hosting a series of short conversations around that theme. I hope you and your families are staying safe. Please follow all the recommended guidelines by the public health expert organizations that are responding to the crisis. Do not spread panic and only share information from credible and verified sources. Thank you. This is Ideas Untrapped Coronavirus Quickcast with Adedayo Bakare. Adedayo, welcome.
Thank you, Toby.
You had a piece today talking about what needs to be done responding to the global pandemic that is now fully with us here in Africa. Can you give us a brief summary of your article?
Okay. So what my co-author and I tried to do was just to look at mostly the economic impact of coronavirus on the Nigerian economy. And as much as possible, we try to look at what government needs to do. So it's not just about the impact on the economy, but on what government needs to do. So on the impact, we have the original channels of transmission to Nigeria, and that is trade and investment. For trade, Nigeria is mainly, our trade is for exports. We do mostly oil. About, I think, over 90% of exports outside Nigeria is oil and gas. Yeah. Then we have a bit of agri exports, but that is still weak. I think total agri exports in Nigeria is under $1 billion, even in 2019, although it's been growing very, very fast for the past 3 years or so. Also, I think the major point for us is that most of the dollar flows we get in Nigeria comes from the exports of oil and gas. Also, for government revenues, most of government revenues comes from the export of oil and gas. Now, the problem with our exports now is even without the impact of the coronavirus, we have Russia and Saudi Arabia engaged in a price war where they've continued to pump a lot of oil into the market, and the implication has been a reduction in oil prices. Also, when you think in terms of the fact that a lot of advanced economies and major emerging markets like China have implemented all sorts of social distancing measures where people have to stay at home and they won't engage in economic activity. That means really the demand or the use of oil will be lower. So for Nigeria, one of the immediate impacts is that exports is going to fall very sharply. And for the CBN, there'll be pressure on the reserves. For the government, there'll be lower revenues. I mean, talking about the government now, is basically both the federal government and the state government. For the imports are important because I was looking at the pattern of trade in 2019, and basically what we continue to see is that industrial supplies, importation of machinery, and agri items and all those things are really the major things we import into Nigeria. Food is really not that even sizable when you think in terms of Nigerian imports. And of course, that is basically due to Nigeria's trade policy, where we don't want the importation of food. We would rather produce them domestically. So for us, another very, very big impact is if manufacturers cannot find inputs to continue to produce necessities, mostly say food items that will be needed as people stay at home, then we'll have problems. Also, when you think in terms of the healthcare industry, what is really the importation need for that industry? When you're thinking in terms of medical equipment, pharmaceutical drugs, medical supplies too, we'll have a problem having to import those things. The problem is not necessarily because there's no money or FX to conduct imports. It's mainly because a lot of countries too are having to close down borders. They are erecting all kinds of export restrictions. And one of the reasons we've seen is countries are panicking, basically. So they are finding ways to defend or to protect their own citizens. So rather than export medical supplies, you want to retain it within the domestic economy. Should an emergency arise and um, you know, you need those supplies. Of course, the outcome for the global economy is not very, very good, because what that means is people who have enough will shut their borders, and people who don't have at all, or people who lack, countries rather, who lack the domestic capacity to produce those items will suffer. Yeah, so moving on, the implication is that for the Nigerian economy, with the new cases we're starting to see, that means even the impact will be felt domestically. And basically, what is government going to do for businesses who have to, not get raw materials and wouldn't be able to produce in sectors where people would have to stay at home? So what does government need to do to support those sectors? Also, when you're thinking in terms of remittances, which is also a very big import into Nigeria, money sent from Nigerians abroad to Nigerians living in Nigeria, basically, is also likely to fall. Um, we've been getting around 20 to 25 billion dollars annually, but given all kinds of problems we're seeing in US and Europe, where there are a lot of Nigerians who send money back home, we should see a bit of a moderation in terms of the remittances we get into the economy in 2020, at least in the first half of 2020. In the latter half, we still really don't know if we'll have to deal considerably with COVID-19. We just think government needs to be smarter currently. Number one, governments will be facing lower revenues. And if you're facing lower revenues, what that means is you probably don't have enough money to support the economy. A lot of economies around the world are, drawing down on the savings they've been able to put together during, periods of economic boom. In Nigeria, we have no savings. And that means for the government, they need to find a way to support not just businesses, but also households. Also, when you think in terms of the FG can still go and borrow. State governments do not have that luxury. So how do you support state governments who need to pay salaries? State governments who also need to support their various, healthcare sectors. So as they face lower revenues, then you can start to expect that the economic hardship will be very, very strong. Unemployment will of course rise as more people stay at home, as a lot of businesses who are not earning enough or have a lot of cash will not be able to afford workers or put them on their payroll, because obviously they are not working and they're not making any money too. In advanced economies, we're starting to see all kinds of grants in the US and the UK being given to small businesses. In Nigeria, we're yet to see that. Again, the government is broke. So if you move further and you start to think about really what to expect you expect that government should find a way to support state governments. Also, government should find a way to support the healthcare sector. We've not been investing in healthcare, we've not been investing in education, and that is one of the things we have to pay for with this, COVID-19 crisis we're currently facing. So it's not just even an economic crisis; it's also going to be a health crisis for Nigeria. So how do we scale up, medical supplies? How do we provide more drugs? How do we mobilize health workers? How do we really support them to give their best in these turbulent times? It's something we have to think about. Also, when you move on and you think in terms of people who are being told to stay at home, once you're telling, market women, stay at home, Okada riders, stay at home, or people who are just in sectors where it is not necessities per se, entertainment, restaurant services, accommodation services, all those things, you would expect that also if they're staying at home, they have to eat, they have to earn income, they have to support their families. So how are they going to go about that? That is left to the government to find a way to also, intervene and support the households as well as the government. Also, we think this is a critical juncture in which government can start to, plan. They say never waste a crisis. And for the federal government, this emergency we have, this health emergency we have, is an excuse for you to actually, implement most of the reforms you've been trying to delay for some time. So the subsidy, remove it. Don't tell us it's price modulation and leave it for the next 4 years like we did in 2016. Make sure you fully remove subsidies. Also, the power sector reforms you have coming up, make sure you implement them. Don't postpone it. Try and find, of course, it's going to be very, very difficult. to cope with all that now. But it's important that government, really takes the chance to make all those reforms. And one of the things we thought of was in terms of the cost, government is not earning enough revenues, but they spend a lot. And most of this spending is on, salaries and payroll related costs, admin costs. Government should find a way to, put a freeze on costs. If it's to freeze hiring, if it's to, just find a way to make sure that, in times like this, you have to keep your costs very, very low. And also try as much as possible to engage citizens to gain their trust. Because in the end, post COVID-19, you need to convince people to give money to you or to pay taxes and to do all these things. So for us, it was mainly looking at the immediate priorities for the government in terms of supporting businesses, supporting the healthcare sector, supporting state governments, also trying to be a bit more responsible in terms of its fiscal finances. And going forward to, it's a chance for government to finally embark on the reforms that are truly needed to move the economy forward.
Okay, all right. So I think a few days ago we were talking about how the economic hardship might play out. And I think we were talking about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which is kind of a way of looking at these things. And something you said was that in Nigeria, aggregate demand seemed to be what would dip faster than aggregate supply. And I think some anecdotal evidence is bearing that out, is that businesses are open, but you see that more and more people are less willing to buy because primarily of income shocks generally. And thank God we are not panicking yet, but when the social distancing measures and lockdown come into effect, that is going to get really worse. So now my question is, who do we prioritize in terms of economic assistance? Is it businesses or households?
It's a hard one, because even in talking about that framework, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, both is equally important. I think the major thing to note now is both is going to fall, right? Aggregate demand in terms of people and businesses not being able to spend enough will fall. Aggregate supply too will fall in terms of businesses not being able to produce, and some businesses basically shutting down operations and staying at home. So both will fall. And the implication of that is we might see a contraction in growth, or maybe a recession, as they say. But in terms of prioritizing emergencies, I think it is important for aggregate supply that we continue to support businesses in essential sectors. Essential means financial institutions, for instance, telecommunications institutions must obviously be open. Food, people selling food, we must ensure that we have that. Food processing as well, we must ensure we have that. Then healthcare sector, in terms of the output, we have to support those sectors. So on the supply side, I think those are really the priorities for the government, because even if you stay at home and you have a lot of money and there's no food to buy, then it becomes a problem, right? So it is crucially important, and it is even easier to support businesses as much as possible. Luckily for us, it's better to even target incentives at businesses than households. And businesses is a way to also target households, in the sense that small businesses that are being supported, can have people on their payroll, which they continue to pay. From the income they generate, then they are able to, buy whatever it is they are producing. For aggregate demand, I think supporting the expenditure of people is a bit tough, because you now start thinking about how do you administer even the intervention funds. In Nigeria, we still don't have a proper identity system. We don't know people who live in a certain place. We don't know the number of people living in a certain place. We don't know whether they're employed. We don't know whether they're even out of jobs currently. So that may be a bit of a very, very hard task to achieve. But for me, I think both are vital. But in prioritizing, we can't afford to let businesses just go off grid like humans have done by staying at home. By staying at home, you probably spend less. You consume, well, maybe you consume more in terms of food, but at least your overall spending should reduce because obviously transportation costs, all manner of restaurants, hotels and spendings you would normally not do before, buying clothes, buying repairing all kinds of items. Now you're prioritizing and you're just staying at home and watching TV, working or eating food, as the case may be. But we have to ensure that at least that food is available for people to eat. So for me, I think it's equally important to support both. So for me, I think what I would just think is that businesses should be prioritized. Governments, state governments particularly should be prioritized. And I'm not saying they should prioritize state governments because of their workers. Public sector workers are a very small share of the total labor force in Nigeria, but because states need to be empowered to actually support healthcare in their respective jurisdictions, they need to be able to take decisions. They need to be able to also maybe revamp facilities, support healthcare workers, import medical supplies, and all these things they might need. But obviously, if government can still find a way to support, households, I think it's fine. But for now, I think priority should be on businesses that provide essential services. Then beyond essential services, if you have some funds with you, then you can support households.
Now, what do you think will be in economic terms, what do you think will be the enduring lessons from a crisis of this nature? Because, okay, now we are having a bit of a double whammy with the oil price collapse. Are we really going to learn?
This is Nigeria, as they say. But really, when we look at the decisions we've made in the past, nothing really inspires confidence, especially in the current leadership. In terms of even the reforms I was talking about earlier, we had a crisis just 4 years ago, 2015 and 2016, and the response to that crisis was terrible, and we had a very painful recession, and recovery has even been very, very slow. So it's like we are starting to recover from a problem we have in 2016, and we are dealt another blow by COVID-19 and whatever is going on in the oil market. For government, I think they have no choice. They have to find a way to respond to the crisis. Now, in thinking about it, they have two options. They either focus on immediate priorities or they focus on priorities that would even outlast this crisis. For me, I think they would lean towards more of the immediate priorities in terms of trying to really make sure that as much as possible the economy doesn't collapse absolutely, as much as possible people can still access some form of medical care, at least if they come under or if they get infected. So they should ramp up healthcare facilities, they should ramp up the sourcing of medical supplies and spending on that, and they should also ramp up support for the healthcare sector. So I think that's the immediate priority, and I think as even when you notice that this is not even a problem that is affecting the segments of the population, it can affect every single person, including people in the leadership. I think there will be a bit more urgency to take the required steps to really make sure that we protect people and the economy at least. But if we're looking towards the longer term policies that you and I would always advocate for all the time, like governments trying to reduce their spending, being more transparent about their spending and their budgets, about, tasking the private sector, delegating responsibilities to the private sector in terms of, funding infrastructure, which the government has no resources to do. I'm thinking in terms of opening up more sectors, say the power sector, to more private participation, say transportation sectors, including aviation and seaports and all those opportunities you can use to just invite the private sector to invest in the economy. I'm not so confident that they are going to take many of those decisions now. Everybody is just waiting till, another phase. This too shall pass, as we say. So I think the priority is on what is immediate and urgent. The reforms that would birth long-term growth or long-term sustainable fiscal policy or long-term sustainable monetary policy or long-term development. I think we're going to just postpone those. So yeah, we are more likely to kick the can down the road.
So now, in terms of emergency responses and what we need and all that, what would be the legacy of the import substitution industrialization that the government through the CBN has been doing in the past 3.5 years, so to speak? I mean, now we have a crisis, but I don't think we have any local capacity to produce what we need. We might still have to rely on imports, sorry. So is that really something that should at least encourage the people in power to change their strategy or change their outlook?
I hope so, because right now more global cooperation is needed, especially in countries like Nigeria, where we don't have that much manufacturing capacity, or even the education at least support the economy in these very trying times. For government, I think it depends, because with what we've seen all around the world, there are all sorts of restrictions everywhere. Even in Europe, you have Germany, which is supposed to be a leader in Europe, stopping or blocking supplies that were meant to go to, is it Austria and Switzerland. Then you start thinking, how does that make sense? You have France also blocking some shipments to the NHS in the UK. And you also ask yourself, how does that make sense? I mean, we've all been trying to promote global trade and global cooperation. So why is everybody withdrawing back from this sort of policy ideas that really help the world? So I think for the Nigerian government, there are two ways to look at it. Some might think, oh, imagine if we had relied on the global economy for food imports, and now everybody is raising export barriers, right? What would Nigerians eat when we can't import from Ghana, or we can't import from Europe, or we can't import from China? So in that sense, one would start to think that, yeah, producing locally might make sense, because when you have this sort of shock externally, then you have a bit of reprieve locally, because your manufacturing sector or your food sector can pick up the slack. So there are two ways to go about it, and I feel like the government will prioritize more import substitution policies, because I've been trying to get people's opinion and ideas about this, and many people were saying, oh, thank God we stopped importing rice, for instance. Oh, thank God we stopped importing this. Of course, you might argue that there are so many things we don't produce locally that we still have to import, which means government really has no choice but to ensure that they cooperate more with other countries. They open the borders and get the shipments we need, the raw materials manufacturers need, the medical supplies we need to even support our economy in this time. Like, we have to import it. But I know if given that choice, what they would focus on is import substitution.
It's still funny to me that people think we stopped importing rice.
A lot of people actually believe it. It's actually quite funny, but somehow
we still mostly consume imported rice, but
exactly, which was why I was just surprised, and that's why I think they would want to focus on that.
Okay. Lastly, before I let you go, you and I have been having this back and forth over services versus manufacturing. So, are you certain now that I am winning the argument? I mean, in the light of, the countries that have been able to respond to these things in terms of testing and capacity to really, really mobilize their health sector have a strong manufacturing base. So, and I think that bolsters my view. I mean, Germany, South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan.
Industrialized economies.
And yes, you have you have US where they are even struggling to get face masks and test kits, and
Yeah.
FDA approvals are coming and not forthcoming. So you agree that I'm winning that argument?
I I think, of course, the argument has always been in your favor, obviously, because, I mean, thinking about it, even industrialized economies are having problems, and having to, meet or get all the supplies they need it's been very, very challenging, even for the so-called Germany. If Germany is not desperate, they wouldn't have stopped shipments to Switzerland, or is it Austria? So obviously, having a manufacturing sector gives you, the ability to respond to all kinds of issues. But I think one thing that is being left out of this discussion is also having a knowledge economy. Because
Yeah,
in the end, if you are not investing in education, healthcare, which are service industries, how do you have the knowledge to be able to say, oh, we can, test these drugs, or invent this vaccine, or I mean, the knowledge that goes into that you give to manufacturers who eventually produce these things. We don't have it in Nigeria, so there's no knowledge, there's no manufacturing capacity. So it's like a double whammy, so to say, again for us. Of course, I think both is something we have to work on. We need to educate our people. We need to prioritize healthcare. We need to fund universities and research institutes and have good people in those places. But overall, I think yes, in times like this, you need your manufacturing sector to respond. I was reading about having to even in non-healthcare manufacturing, you have a lot of manufacturers finding ways to produce some of these medical supplies, and it's that kind of flexibility you want. So of course, I agree with you. We need more manufacturing capacity. But I think, again, the road to that is very, very tough.
yeah,
So it could be a simple case of, imagine if we had the knowledge, Toby, and we have educated people. Our lecturers are not sitting down at home like us without doing anything. Because I'm here to see researchers in Nigeria coming out to say this is how to respond. This is or testing things, or informing the general public, or
yeah.
people with laboratories trying to do things. We're not seeing any of that. But I feel like
No,
it's a case of, say, oh, Morocco has very good manufacturing sector, SA has a very good manufacturing sector, Ethiopia has a better manufacturing sector, so to say. How do we use the knowledge that we have from our education and healthcare institutions to collaborate with those countries and get some of the medical supplies we need? We are not able to do that as well. So I think I agree with you that we need to continue to invest in these priority sectors, and also manufacturing. I'm actually very, very happy that we have this problem, because
why?
it would seem as if when we say invest in people, you sound like a broken clock or something. Like,
Mhm.
people are always saying invest in people, invest in people. It's maybe hard for people to understand why you would continue to, hammer that. Bill Gates came to Nigeria, right, and mentioned
Yeah,
it. Focus more on less on physical infrastructure. See how you build your people. A lot of analysts and economists talk about it all the time, but it seems government really doesn't understand, and their focus is entirely on building the maybe first generation real technology where the world has advanced beyond, and building terrible bridges, unneeded overhead bridges, and all those things. So maybe this would force government at least to think of reforms that we need in healthcare and in education. I think knowledge is even more important today than having physical manufacturing assets.
Okay, so I have a bit of a counter on that,
Okay.
and which is, and I think I was also discussing this with a mutual friend of ours, you and I, very recently. Knowledge-based human capital have a bit of a delayed return. Okay, so for example, if you invest in, say, an additional year of schooling for
Yeah.
people with no access to education now, the primary schooling. So you're looking at the return horizon of 30, 35 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that really solves our problem now. But if we can get industries to transfer skill and knowledge in the immediate, I think we can see the effect, the positive effect of that immediately. Even though that does not stop us from investing in the future, but it's one of the things, okay, like Paul Roma had this thought experiment, that, okay, say you're trying to hire two people. So, and you're interviewing these two people, and one of them had an additional year of schooling, and the
Yeah.
other spent a year at Toyota, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Who would you hire?
The guy at Toyota now, obviously.
So exactly. So I mean, if we have an export-oriented industrialization policy where we can get big manufacturing firms here that can transfer knowledge and skill via firm to firm relationships, I think that will work for us a lot faster without negating the investments that we need to make over the long time horizon in terms of education. I mean, when China started industrializing, it wasn't mutually exclusive. I mean, they now have some of the best universities in the world, and they still manage to industrialize and employ millions of people from 1978 to about year 2000. So I think we should try to just find the right balance.
I agree. I totally agree with that. I mean, we can import the knowledge and transfer the knowledge easier to support skills transfer locally. So I totally am sold on that idea. I think it's um, something that will work. Of course, with if you have the right leadership to think about it and implement it.
All right. So before I let you go, what are the implications for two of your favorite sectors? That is tech and education. I know. Sorry, tech and entertainment. Sorry.
Yeah,
Uh, I know remote work is big now, but I'm not seeing
yeah,
any Nigerian firm stepping up to the plate. So
hmm
everybody is using Zoom. Zoom is not a Nigerian firm.
of course.
uh, and of course, we learned a few hours ago that the African Magic Award
Yeah,
had some exposed
yeah.
people. What are the implications for these two sectors that you follow and love so very much?
Okay, I think what happened, the decision, despite what that was going on with the world, to continue with that award show was highly responsible by the organizers, and basically they put everybody at risk. Also, it shows a lot about the lack of personal responsibility in Nigeria. I don't know if it's due to poor education. I know better not to know it's due to poor education. Maybe it's due to the lack of responsibility generally in our culture. Because I don't think, a right thinking person who had gone to countries with very high infection rate should just come into Nigeria and not isolate themselves and put others at risk. Okay, but to go specifically to your points, tech, it's going to be a very tough period for technology businesses, especially those who are looking to raise funding currently. Um, I don't think any most companies abroad, nobody's looking at making long-term investment decisions right now until this phase passes. Those companies who need urgent funding to at least be alive for some time before they start generating revenues or enough revenues might have to contend with very, very difficult times and might even have to, lay off some workers until they get back on their feet. But also, we have some tech companies who will be in high demand now because now a lot of people have to rely on digital financial services, for instance, and we have some work operating in that area. trying to buy things online as you do not want to go out, money transfers and everything. All these things will still be facilitated by tech. But again, coronavirus is not something that would persist for the long term. It's something it's just a phase that will pass. And Nigerian technology sector is still in its infancy. So also regarding most of the developments you mentioned in terms of productivity tools that we're using currently for remote work, I think a lot of technology companies will eventually scale up to be able to offer those services. But I know we are not big on productivity services right now in Nigeria. We all use Microsoft and Google and all those multinationals. In entertainment too, I think also it's a big problem because for entertainment there's a lot of having to go for tours and concerts and going to perform there's a lot of performance involved to an audience, and most of them can't do that now, and a lot of them are out of jobs. So all people who would naturally support the shooting of music videos or shooting the Nollywood films and everything, everybody's on break, and that is a problem. But again, entertainment is waning because people are staying at home and they'll be watching Netflix. And of course, people are demanding to be entertained. And that is why on Instagram, we have all kinds of shows going on, concerts, DJs playing, music for people. So it's a very big setback for that industry. But of course, I'm still a long-term believer in the fact that tech and entertainment, focusing on tech and entertainment will do Nigeria a lot of good. COVID-19 will pass now, and people will return back to their jobs. Wizkid will have to perform again, and I just fear for the tech sectors because they depend a lot on external funding. So that is really where I'm very, very concerned about.
Thank you very much, Adidare, for your thoughts.
Thanks for having me, Toby.